We are live outside Ashbourne Global Trust, where a historic announcement is expected today.
Some mistakes don't destroy your life overnight. They wait, patiently, quietly. They hide in your memories, growing heavier with every passing year, until one ordinary morning, they become impossible to outrun. For Daniel Harper, that morning began beneath a gray London sky. Rain drifted softly across the glass towers of 1-4, turning the streets into shimmering reflections of headlights and hurried footsteps. Business executives crossed the square with umbrellas held high, while television crews assembled outside one of the city's most prestigious financial buildings. Satellite vans lined the pavement. Reporters adjusted their microphones. Camera flashes burst like lightning. Across a giant digital screen mounted above the entrance appeared a headline that had captured the attention of the entire country. Ashbourne Global Trust announces new chairperson. A hush settled over the crowd. The doors opened. Out stepped a woman dressed in an elegant navy coat, her dark hair moving gently in the morning breeze. She wasn't surrounded by extravagance or theatrical displays of wealth. She walked with calm confidence, acknowledging employees by name as they greeted her with genuine respect. The reporters called out, "Lady Ashbourne, over here! How does it feel to become Britain's youngest chair of the Ashbourne Global Trust?" She paused for a moment and smiled politely before continuing toward the entrance. There was no arrogance in her expression, no hunger for attention, only quiet dignity. Daniel Harper stood across the street, frozen beneath the rain. He watched the woman disappear into the building. His hands trembled, not because of the cold, but because that woman had once stood barefoot in a tiny Yorkshire kitchen, laughing as she burned toast while humming old songs on a quiet Sunday morning. That woman had once been his wife, Grace Harper. Now the world knew her by another name, Grace Ashbourne, the heir to one of Britain's oldest and most respected private investment dynasties. The woman he had walked away from because he believed she had nothing left to offer him. Daniel lowered his eyes. He still carried his wedding ring, not on his finger, in his coat pocket. He had never found the courage to throw it away. Somewhere behind him, two young journalists spoke quietly. "I heard she inherited nearly everything. They say the Ashbourne family controls investments across Europe." "I can't imagine what that's like." Daniel closed his eyes. Neither could he, because when Grace had shared a small rented cottage with him in North Yorkshire, she had never mentioned any of it, not the family, not the fortune, not the responsibility waiting patiently for her to return. She had chosen a simple life. She had chosen him, and he had mistaken her humility for ordinary. That mistake would haunt him for the rest of his life. But to understand how one man lost the greatest treasure he would ever know, we have to return to a time before the headlines, before the boardrooms, before the betrayal, back to a quiet village where happiness wasn't measured in bank accounts. It was measured in moments. If you enjoy stories where hidden truths change lives forever, take a moment to subscribe to the Unspoken chapter and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover unforgettable stories of love, betrayal, redemption, and the secrets that time can no longer hide. Because in every family, every friendship, and every heart, there is always an unspoken chapter waiting to be revealed. 10 years earlier, morning arrived gently over the rolling countryside of Loch. Mist floated above endless green fields bordered by ancient stone walls. Church bells echoed through the valley as villagers unlocked little cafes and bakeries that had served the same families for generations. The world moved more slowly here. No one rushed. No one cared who wore designer suits. People still greeted strangers with a smile. And tucked away at the end of a quiet country lane stood a modest stone cottage with ivy climbing its walls. It wasn't grand. The roof leaked during heavy rain. The windows rattled whenever winter winds swept across the hills. The kitchen floor creaked with every step. Yet inside those walls lived two people who believed they possessed everything that mattered. Grace stood by the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron pan, while a kettle whistled softly nearby. She smiled as footsteps creaked overhead. Daniel was awake. A few moments later, he wandered downstairs, his shirt untucked and his hair still untidy from sleep. "You've done it again," he said with a grin. Grace looked over her shoulder innocently. "Done what?" "You've burned the toast." She laughed. "I call it character. You call everything character. Only the things that refuse to be perfect." Daniel walked over, kissed her forehead, and stole a piece of bacon from the pan. Grace gently nudged him away with the wooden spoon. "You'll ruin breakfast." "I thought I already had." She laughed again. It was the kind of laugh that filled a room without demanding attention. Simple, warm, honest. The sort of laugh people spent lifetimes searching for. Daniel often wondered how he'd been fortunate enough to find someone like her. They weren't wealthy, far from it. Daniel worked as a junior financial analyst in York, commuting each morning by train while dreaming of one day climbing the corporate ladder. Grace worked part-time restoring old books for a local heritage charity and spent her spare time volunteering at the village food bank. Neither earned very much. But every Friday evening, they shared fish and chips on a bench overlooking the river. Every Sunday, they walked through the countryside regardless of the weather. Every Christmas, they exchanged handmade gifts because expensive presents had never meant much to either of them. At least, not yet. Daniel looked around the tiny kitchen. "I've been thinking." Grace poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. "That usually means trouble." He smiled. "My manager hinted there might be a promotion coming." Grace's face lit up. "Daniel, that's wonderful." "It isn't confirmed." "It doesn't matter. I'm proud of you already." Those words settled quietly in his heart. She always believed in him, even when he doubted himself, even when life became difficult. What Daniel didn't know, what no one in the village could have imagined, was that the woman encouraging him across that worn wooden table was quietly carrying a secret powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. A secret she had sworn never to reveal until she was certain she had married a man who loved Grace, and not the name she had left behind. As Daniel picked up his briefcase and kissed her goodbye, a black luxury car slowed briefly at the end of the lane. Its driver looked toward the cottage, then drove away without stopping. Grace watched from the window. The smile faded from her face. Very softly, almost as though speaking to herself, she whispered, "They've found me." The black motorcar disappeared around the bend before anyone else in the village noticed it. Grace remained standing by the kitchen window, her fingers tightening around the warm coffee mug. Her heartbeat quickened. After all these years, how had they found her? She waited until Daniel's train had long since disappeared towards York before stepping outside. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. A robin perched on the old stone fence while the village slowly came to life around her. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet somehow, nothing felt the same. A folded cream-colored envelope rested inside her handbag. She had carried it everywhere since the day her grandmother placed it into her hands. Inside were instructions that could change her future forever. Instructions she prayed she would never need to follow. Her grandmother's final words echoed inside her mind. "When they come looking for you, Grace, it means the time for hiding has ended." She closed her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. I've finally built the life I wanted." Meanwhile, Daniel arrived at the offices of Pierce and Whitmore Capital in York, expecting another ordinary day. Instead, his manager was waiting outside his office. "Daniel, would you join me?" Daniel's stomach tightened. Had he made a mistake? Had something gone wrong? The manager smiled. "Relax. You're not in trouble." Inside the executive meeting room sat three unfamiliar faces. Senior partners. Daniel had only ever seen them from a distance. One of them slid a folder across the polished table. "We've been reviewing your work." Daniel nodded nervously. "We're impressed." He looked up. Very impressed. Another partner smiled. "You've been recommended for the Strategic Growth Program." Daniel blinked. The program was legendary within the company. Only a handful of employees had ever been selected. Most eventually became directors. His voice almost disappeared. I don't know what to say. The senior partner leaned forward. Say yes. Laughter filled the room. For the first time in years, Daniel felt as though every sacrifice had finally begun to matter. That evening, he almost ran home. He burst through the cottage door with the enthusiasm of a young man carrying impossible news. Grace, she emerged from the kitchen. You're smiling. I got it. The program. Grace dropped the dish towel and wrapped her arms around him. I knew you would. I told you. You've always been capable of far more than you believed. Daniel laughed. We're finally moving forward. Grace smiled. We've always been moving forward. Daniel paused. Had they? Sometimes he felt as though they had spent years standing still while the rest of the world raced ahead. He pushed the thought away. Tonight wasn't for doubts. Tonight was for celebration. They celebrated at their favorite little pub overlooking the river. Nothing extravagant. Just steak pie, mashed potatoes, and 2 glasses of cider. Grace lifted her glass. To new beginnings. Daniel smiled. To our future. Neither realized how differently they imagined that future. 2 weeks later, the Strategic Growth Program began. It introduced Daniel to clients whose names regularly appeared in business magazines. International investors, technology entrepreneurs, banking executives, people who discussed million-pound deals as casually as ordering coffee. It fascinated him. He worked harder than ever before. Longer hours, later evenings, weekend seminars. Every opportunity felt like another rung on the ladder he had dreamed of climbing. Grace supported him without complaint. She packed extra lunches, left encouraging notes inside his briefcase, waited awake even when meetings kept him out late. She celebrated every achievement as though it belonged to both of them. Daniel appreciated it. He truly did. Yet something inside him had begun changing. Success had introduced him to a world where everyone seemed wealthier, smarter, more sophisticated. He found himself comparing his clothes, his car, his home, his life. Comparison is a quiet thief. It rarely announces its arrival. It simply whispers that what you already have is no longer enough. One rainy afternoon, the program participants gathered at an investment conference in York's historic Guildhall. Representatives from across Britain had traveled to attend. Daniel stood near the refreshments table when the room suddenly fell silent. People began turning towards the entrance. A woman stepped inside wearing a charcoal-tailored suit beneath a camel-colored coat. She wasn't surrounded by photographers. She wasn't demanding attention. Yet somehow, she possessed it effortlessly. Conversations stopped. Executives straightened their posture. Several senior partners immediately walked over to greet her. Daniel quietly asked the colleague beside him, "Who is she?" The colleague looked surprised. "You've never heard of Vanessa Blackwood?" Daniel shook his head. Blackwood Capital, one of the most influential private investment firms in Europe. Daniel watched as Vanessa greeted everyone with calm confidence. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She simply carried herself like someone who belonged wherever she stood. Moments later, she was introduced to the program participants. When she reached Daniel, she smiled warmly. "Daniel Harper, I've read one of your market reports." His eyebrows lifted. "You have?" It was insightful. "You recognized opportunities others overlooked." Daniel laughed nervously. "I'm honored." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Never be surprised when your work speaks before you do." The conversation lasted barely 3 minutes. Yet Daniel thought about it all afternoon, not because she had complimented him, but because someone of her reputation had noticed him. Sometimes, the smallest recognition awakens the largest ambitions. That same evening, Grace sat alone in the village library, restoring a century-old leather-bound journal. The room was peaceful. Only the soft ticking of an antique clock disturbed the silence. Then her phone vibrated. The screen displayed a single name. Arthur Pembroke, She stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Arthur." His familiar voice carried both warmth and concern. "It's good to hear your voice again, Miss Ashbourne. You know I prefer Grace." "I know. But some habits become impossible to forget." Grace smiled faintly. "I suppose they do." Arthur became unusually quiet. "I'm afraid I wouldn't have called unless it was important." She already knew. "The board?" "Yes. They've been asking questions." Grace closed her eyes. "I need more time. So did your grandmother. But time rarely asks our permission before moving on." Arthur paused. "Grace, there are matters that require your signature." "I can't. My life is here now." Arthur spoke gently. "And if the life you've chosen begins to slip away." Grace didn't answer, because somewhere deep inside, she feared it already had. Late that night, Daniel finally arrived home. The cottage lights were still on. Grace sat asleep in the armchair with a book resting in her lap. A knitted blanket had slipped onto the floor. Daniel stood watching her. For a long moment, he remembered exactly why he had fallen in love with her. She had never asked him to become someone else, never measured him by money, never compared him to anyone. She simply loved him, quietly, completely. He bent down to cover her with the blanket. As he did, her handbag slipped gently onto the floor. The cream-colored envelope slid halfway out. Across its front, embossed in deep blue ink, were 3 words that made Daniel pause. "Ashbourne Trust." He frowned. He had never heard Grace mention that name. Before he could look closer, Grace stirred awake. She quickly picked up the envelope and smiled. "Oh, I must have dropped it." Daniel looked at her curiously. "What's the Ashbourne Trust?" For the briefest moment, Grace hesitated. Then she forced a smile. "Just some old family paperwork." Daniel nodded. He didn't ask another question, but as they climbed the stairs together, a tiny seed of curiosity had been planted, and neither of them realized it was about to grow into something that would test every promise they had ever made. There is an old saying in the Yorkshire countryside: houses don't fall apart because of one broken stone. They fall apart because small cracks are ignored until the walls can no longer carry the weight. No one notices the first crack, not at first. It begins with postponed conversations, missed dinners, promises to make time tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. Until one day, 2 people who once knew everything about each other realize they have become strangers. That was exactly what happened to Daniel and Grace. Winter arrived earlier than expected. The mornings were darker now. Frost covered the cottage roof before sunrise, while thin wisps of smoke curled from neighboring chimneys into the cold Yorkshire air. Grace still woke before Daniel every morning. She still prepared breakfast. She still tucked handwritten notes into his briefcase. "Good luck with your presentation. Don't forget to eat lunch. I'm proud of you." Daniel read every note. Sometimes he even smiled, but he no longer placed them back into his pocket. By lunchtime, they usually ended up forgotten beside coffee cups or buried beneath financial reports. Not because he loved Grace any less, because his mind had become crowded with something else. The constant pursuit of becoming someone greater than he already was. The strategic growth program demanded more from him each week. More travel, more networking, more late-night dinners with investors. His name had begun circulating among executives. People who had never noticed him before now remembered his opinions. Invitations arrived almost daily. Business breakfasts, leadership seminars, private receptions. Each invitation felt like another door opening. Daniel convinced himself he was doing it all for their future. A larger home, children one day, freedom from financial worry. Yet ambition has a dangerous habit. It often disguises obsession as responsibility. One Friday evening, Grace stood at the cottage window, watching heavy rain strike the garden path. Dinner had been ready for almost an hour. A shepherd's pie sat untouched in the oven. Candles burned slowly across the dining table. She glanced at the clock. 7:30. Daniel had promised he would be home by 6. At 20 minutes to 8, the phone finally rang. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said. His voice sounded hurried. The meeting overran. Grace smiled despite the disappointment. "Drive safely." "I will. I'll keep dinner warm." She hung up and quietly blew out the candles. The pie remained in the oven. By the time Daniel returned, it had gone cold. He found Grace asleep on the sofa, with a book resting across her lap. He stood there for several seconds. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. He reached down to wake her gently. "I'm home." Grace opened her eyes. "You ate?" Daniel hesitated. There was food at the meeting. She smiled softly. "That's all right. I'll put this away." She carried the untouched dinner into the kitchen. Daniel watched from the doorway. Something inside him whispered that he should say more. Apologize properly. Hold her. Tell her she mattered more than any meeting. Instead, he remained silent. Sometimes silence wounds more deeply than harsh words. The following Monday, Vanessa Blackwood invited Daniel to lunch. Not in a crowded restaurant, but at a quiet members club overlooking the River Ouse. The room was elegant without feeling extravagant. Dark oak panels, soft leather chairs, a fire burning gently in the corner. Vanessa believed important conversations deserved calm surroundings. As tea was served, she studied Daniel carefully. "You've been distracted." He smiled politely. "Have I?" "You have." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Is everything all right at home?" Daniel looked away. "It's complicated." Vanessa nodded. "Most worthwhile things usually are." There was a long pause. Then Daniel surprised himself by speaking honestly. "I feel as though I'm living two different lives." "How so?" "When I'm at work, I feel inspired, driven, like I'm finally becoming the man I always wanted to be. And when you're home," Daniel hesitated. "I don't know. I feel," he searched for the right word, "guilty." Vanessa didn't rush to answer. She allowed the silence to settle. Finally she spoke. "Sometimes people outgrow the lives they began with." Daniel frowned. "Do you believe that?" "I believe growth often asks difficult questions." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something. When was the last time your wife truly spoke to you about her own dreams?" Daniel blinked. He couldn't remember, because Grace rarely talked about herself. She always asked about him, his work, his goals, his worries. Vanessa continued gently. "Relationships only survive when both people are growing in the same direction." Daniel looked down into his untouched tea. Her words stayed with him long after lunch had ended. That same afternoon, Grace arrived at Ashbourne Hall for the first time in nearly 6 years. The gates opened slowly. Ancient oak trees lined the long driveway, their bare branches reaching across the road like silent guardians of the estate. She had spent years trying not to come back. Not because she disliked the place, because she feared what returning would mean. Arthur Pembroke stood waiting beneath the stone entrance. Though older now, he still carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had devoted his life to serving the Ashbourne family. "It's good to have you home," he said warmly. Grace looked towards the grand manor. "It doesn't feel like home anymore." Arthur smiled sadly. "Sometimes home waits patiently for us to be ready." Inside, nothing had changed. The portraits, the library, the scent of polished oak, the grandfather clock that chimed every hour. It was as though time itself had refused to move. Arthur led her into her grandmother's private study. On the desk rested a leather-bound folder sealed with the Ashbourne crest. Grace recognized it immediately. The succession papers. Arthur nodded. "The board can no longer delay." Grace looked away. "I never wanted this life." "No, you wanted something far rarer." Arthur smiled gently. "You wanted to be loved without it." A tear formed in Grace's eyes. "I thought I had been." Arthur opened the folder. Inside were photographs, annual reports, charitable foundation accounts, scholarship programs, hospital projects, thousands of employees, thousands of families whose livelihoods depended upon the Ashbourne Trust. "This isn't only about wealth," Arthur said quietly. It's about responsibility. Grace slowly turned the pages. Her grandmother had spent decades building something that changed lives. She couldn't abandon it, but accepting it meant revealing the truth, not only to the world, to Daniel. At last she whispered, "I'll tell him." Arthur smiled. "When?" Grace looked towards the rain falling beyond the tall windows. "Before someone else does." Back in York, Daniel was working late when Oliver Bennett stopped beside his desk. Oliver had become more than a colleague over the years. He was one of the few people Daniel trusted completely. "You've been different lately," Oliver said. Daniel barely looked up from his computer. "Busy?" "No." Oliver folded his arms. "Not busy. Distant." Daniel sighed. "I'm just trying to build a better future." Oliver nodded slowly. "So was my father." Daniel looked up. "What happened?" Oliver's expression darkened. He became so focused on providing a better life that he forgot to live the one he already had. The office fell quiet. Oliver picked up his coat. "Just be careful. Some people spend years climbing the ladder, only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall." Daniel watched him leave. For the first time, the words unsettled him. He thought about Grace, about the untouched dinners, the little handwritten notes, the envelope marked Ashbourne Trust, the questions he never asked, the conversations they never finished. Outside the office window, snow began to fall over York. Inside, neither Daniel nor Grace realized that time was running out, because somewhere in London, Vanessa Blackwood had just received a confidential file. On its cover, one name was printed in bold black letters: Grace Ashbourne. Vanessa looked at the file for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she smiled. There is a moment in every life, so ordinary that it almost passes unnoticed. A missed phone call, a delayed journey, an unanswered question, a decision made in less than a minute. Yet years later, that single moment becomes the dividing line between the life you lived and the life you might have had. For Daniel Harper, that moment arrived on a cold Thursday evening. He didn't recognize it at the time. No one ever does. The Christmas lights had begun to appear across the streets of York. Shop windows glowed with warm golden colors, while families hurried home carrying gifts and groceries. The city was preparing for the holidays. Daniel, however, barely noticed. His days had become a cycle of meetings, presentations, and networking dinners. His promotion had brought everything he once desired: a larger office, a substantial salary increase, recognition from senior executives. Yet every achievement demanded another sacrifice, another late night, another canceled dinner, another promise to Grace that things will settle down soon. They never did. Grace sat alone in the cottage, wrapping a small Christmas gift. Inside the neatly folded paper was an old fountain pen. Nothing expensive. Months earlier, Daniel had admired it in the window of an antique bookshop. He'd smiled and said, "One day, when I become a director, I'll sign my contracts with a pen like that." Grace had quietly returned the following week and bought it. She couldn't afford it outright. The elderly shopkeeper had allowed her to pay in small installments. She had never told Daniel. To her, love had never been measured by the size of a gift. It was measured by noticing the little things. She tied the ribbon carefully, then looked at the empty chair across the table. "I hope you're home before it gets cold," she whispered. Across town, Daniel was attending another private dinner hosted by Vanessa Blackwood. This time, however, the conversation wasn't about investments. It was about people. Vanessa watched him as waiters cleared the main course. "Tell me honestly," she said, "when you first married Grace, what did you dream your life would look like?" Daniel smiled faintly. "A cottage, a family, peace. And now," he stared into his glass. "I don't know anymore." Vanessa didn't interrupt. "I feel like I've spent years standing still. I finally have a chance to build something extraordinary." She nodded. "Ambition isn't something to be ashamed of." "No, but it becomes dangerous when you believe you have to apologize for it." Daniel looked thoughtful. You make it sound simple. No, she replied quietly. It never is. Then she placed a folder on the table. Inside was an offer from Blackwood Capital, Executive Strategy Director. The salary was more than Daniel had imagined earning in a decade. There were also shares in the company, performance bonuses, international travel, a relocation package. He looked up in disbelief. Why me? Vanessa answered honestly. Because you're capable, and because I need someone I can trust. Daniel swallowed. It wasn't just a job, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. But accepting it would mean moving to London, traveling frequently, starting an entirely different life. A life that Grace had never imagined. That same evening, Grace arrived at Ashbourne Hall after receiving an urgent call from Arthur. The board had gathered in the old library. Some faces looked anxious, others frustrated. Arthur stood as Grace entered. They've made another approach. Grace frowned. Who has? Arthur exchanged a glance with the trustees. A consortium of international investors. They want influence over the trust's future. Grace looked around the room. And if we refuse, they'll continue buying voting rights through smaller holdings. She understood immediately. It wasn't simply a business move. It was a battle over the future of everything her grandmother had built. Arthur spoke quietly. They'll only stop when the new chair is publicly confirmed. The room fell silent. Grace knew what that meant. If she accepted, the world would know her name. The newspapers would discover her marriage. Daniel would learn the truth from headlines instead of from her. She had spent years trying to protect him from that. Now, time had run out. Driving home through the snow, Grace made her decision. No more secrets. She would tell Daniel everything. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the contract Vanessa had offered him. His phone vibrated. A message from Grace. Please come home early. There's something I need to tell you. Love, Grace. He smiled. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. Perhaps they would finally have the conversation they both needed. Then another notification appeared. Vanessa. The board has approved the offer. I need your answer tonight. Daniel looked from one message to the other. 2 roads, 2 futures, 1 choice. He closed his eyes. I'll only be an hour, he whispered to himself. He picked up his coat and drove to London. Grace reached the cottage first. She lit the fire, set 2 plates on the table, placed the cream-colored Ashbourne folder beside her. Tonight, Daniel would finally learn that she wasn't simply Grace Harper. She was Grace Ashbourne, the woman entrusted with one of Britain's oldest family legacies. She rehearsed the words again and again. Every version sounded impossible. How do you explain that you've hidden not another life, but the very foundation of your identity? 9 o'clock. No Daniel. 10 o'clock. Still nothing. Finally, her phone rang. I'm sorry, Daniel said. His voice echoed through a hotel corridor. I've been delayed. Grace looked at the untouched dinner. The candles had almost burned away. I understand. You always understand. She smiled sadly. Good night, Daniel. She ended the call before he could hear the tears in her voice. Then she quietly placed the Ashbourne folder back into its envelope. Another opportunity had slipped away. Another truth remained hidden. The next morning, the country's leading financial newspapers carried the same headline. Ashbourne Global Trust, to announce new chair within days. Grace stared at the newspaper in silence. She had wanted Daniel to hear the truth from her. Now she feared he would hear it from everyone else. And across London, Vanessa stood in her office, looking at the confidential dossier bearing Grace's full name. She finally understood why Daniel's wife had seemed so familiar. Grace wasn't just connected to the Ashbourne family. She was the Ashbourne family. Vanessa closed the file slowly. Then, for the first time, she whispered words that revealed her true concern. This changes everything. The newspapers arrived before sunrise. On kitchen tables, at railway stations, in cafes across Britain. One headline dominated every front page. Ashbourne Global Trust names new chairperson. After years of secrecy, speculation spread quickly. Television channels interrupted their morning programs. Business analysts debated what the announcement meant for Britain's financial landscape. No one knew who would step through those doors. No one except Arthur Pembroke. Standing in the quiet entrance hall of Ashbourne Hall, Arthur adjusted his tie and looked toward the grand staircase. Grace descended slowly. She wore a simple navy suit. No diamonds, no extravagant jewelry. Only the silver watch her grandmother had worn for more than 30 years. Arthur smiled. Your grandmother always said true leadership should enter the room before wealth does. Grace returned the smile. I only hope I can live up to her example. Arthur nodded. You already have. Across London, Daniel hurried into the conference room at Blackwood Capital. Everyone seemed distracted. Televisions mounted on the walls displayed live coverage from Ashbourne Hall. One colleague laughed. They've kept this secret for years. Another replied, whoever takes over will instantly become one of the most influential business leaders in Europe. Daniel barely listened. His thoughts were elsewhere. Grace had barely spoken to him since the missed dinner. Their conversations had become painfully polite. The warmth had disappeared. For the first time, he wondered whether success had cost him more than it had given him. The broadcast began. Reporters crowded the entrance. Cameras flashed. The announcer spoke. For decades, the Ashbourne family has quietly shaped industries, funded hospitals, preserved historic institutions, and invested in communities across Britain. Today, the identity of the family's new chair will finally be revealed. The great oak doors opened. Arthur stepped outside first. Then, Grace. The room around Daniel fell completely silent. Someone whispered, "That's Grace Ashbourne." Another answered, "She's been living out of the public eye for years." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. No, it couldn't be. The cameras followed her as she walked confidently toward the podium. The woman on the screen wasn't just someone who looked like his wife. She was his wife. Or rather, the woman who had once been his wife. Grace adjusted the microphone. Her voice was calm, measured. Good morning. My grandmother taught me that wealth is never measured by what we keep, but by what we give. For many years, I chose to live away from public attention because I wanted to understand life beyond privilege. I wanted to earn trust rather than inherit it. That lesson has shaped every decision I make. Daniel stared at the screen. Memories flooded back. The modest cottage, the burnt toast, the handwritten notes in his briefcase, the old fountain pen, the envelope marked Ashbourne Trust, the dinners she waited to share with him, the nights she sat alone while he chased another meeting. Every unanswered question suddenly had an answer. She hadn't been hiding another man. She hadn't been hiding shame. She had been protecting the only thing she feared would change how he saw her. Her name. Vanessa entered the conference room quietly. She looked at the screen, then at Daniel. I was going to tell you. Daniel's eyes never left the television. You knew? Vanessa nodded. I discovered the truth only recently. Why didn't you tell me? She answered honestly. Because I realized it wasn't my secret to reveal. There was no triumph in her voice, only regret. I also realized something else. Daniel looked at her. You never really left, Grace, because of me. You left because you started believing that the life you had wasn't enough. Her words struck harder than any accusation. She was right. Vanessa hadn't destroyed his marriage. She had merely appeared after the cracks had already begun. The choices had always been his. Weeks later, the divorce was final. Grace signed the papers without bitterness. Daniel signed them with trembling hands. Not because he wanted to end the marriage, because he finally understood that he had ended it long before either of them entered the solicitor's office. Months passed. Ashbourne Hall became a symbol of renewal under Grace's leadership. The trust expanded scholarships for disadvantaged students. It opened new medical research centers. It restored historic libraries. Employees admired her not because she was wealthy, but because she listened. She remembered names. She visited projects without cameras. She believed leadership was service, exactly as her grandmother had taught her. Daniel left Blackwood Capital, not in disgrace, but by choice. He accepted a modest role with a financial charity that helped struggling families rebuild after debt. The salary was smaller, the office less impressive. Yet for the first time in years, his work felt meaningful. Success, he realized, had nothing to do with status. It had everything to do with purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year later, their paths crossed again. Not at a board meeting, not in a courtroom, but on a quiet riverside path in North Yorkshire, the very place where they had once shared fish and chips on Friday evenings. Grace was walking alone. Daniel stopped a respectful distance away. "Hello, Grace." She smiled gently. "Hello, Daniel." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The river flowed peacefully between the autumn trees. Finally, Daniel said, "I owe you an apology." Grace looked at him. "You've apologized before." "I know, but this time I'm not apologizing because I lost your wealth." He shook his head. "I'm apologizing because I failed to see your worth when all you offered me was your heart." Grace's eyes softened. "I never wanted you to choose my family's name. I wanted you to choose me." Daniel lowered his head. "I know. I understand that now." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not angry, simply honest. Daniel reached into his coat pocket. He removed his wedding ring. For years, he had carried it everywhere. Unable to let go, he placed it gently on the stone wall beside the river. "I think it's finally time." Grace looked at the ring, then back at Daniel. She nodded. "Take care of yourself. And you." She walked away. Daniel didn't call after her. Some endings deserve peace more than another chance. He watched until she disappeared beyond the trees. Then he picked up the ring one last time. Not to wear it, but to remember. Life has a curious way of revealing what truly matters. Some people spend years chasing fortunes, only to discover that the greatest treasure was waiting for them around an ordinary kitchen table. Daniel believed he was leaving his wife for a richer future. What he never understood was that the richest part of his life had never been measured in pounds. It had been measured in quiet breakfasts, shared dreams, burnt toast, handwritten notes, and a woman who loved him enough to hide a fortune so she could discover whether his love was real. By the time he learned the truth, the lesson had already been written, not in newspapers, not in boardrooms, but in the unspoken chapter of his own heart. If this story moved you, remember that the strongest relationships are rarely broken by one dramatic moment. More often, they are worn away by small choices, postponed conversations, and opportunities to love that we assume will always be there. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the Unspoken chapter, where every hidden secret eventually comes to light. Share this story with someone who believes that success means more than money, and let us know in the comments, what do you think Daniel truly lost? The fortune, or the woman who chose him before anyone else did? Until next time, see you in the next chapter.